Behind a Pennsylvania farmhouse sits a stone cellar, the last trace of the first Amish settlement in America, a community a massacre once tried to erase. The story says the Amish simply sailed here and farmed quietly for 300 years. What actually happened was a near-extinction event, and a genetic bottleneck still running through 500,000 descendants today. A state marker, planted in 1959, gives the public one version of that night, the wrong one, according to the family that lived it. In Berks County, 1757, one settler named Jacob Hochstetler made a choice that cost him everything. That's the version most people carry around without ever questioning it. The version handed down in passing conversation and half-remembered history class. Quiet farms, horse-drawn buggies, a community persecuted somewhere far away that crossed an ocean once, found peace, and never really needed telling twice. It's the version on museum placards, the version that fits neatly into a comfortable afternoon documentary about simple living. It isn't wrong exactly, it's just missing almost everything that actually matters. Here's what most people genuinely don't know. The part that never makes it into the passed down version. The first identifiable Amish congregation in the American colonies wasn't in Lancaster County, the place most associated with Amish life today. It was here, along a creek called the Northkill, in what is now Berks County. Settlers began arriving as early as 1736. By 1740, historians agree, there was an organized Amish community here, the first true congregation on this continent. Within a few years, it had grown to roughly 40 families, 150 to 200 people, making it for a time the largest Amish settlement anywhere in America. From that settlement, from those families, an entire religious culture would eventually spread outward across Pennsylvania into Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, until it became the nearly 500,000 person community that exists today. This is where it started. This is the root system. And almost nobody, outside of genealogists and local historians, has ever heard its name. By 1742, the settlement had grown enough to do something remarkable for a community of persecuted outsiders. They petitioned the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly directly, asking for the legal right to become naturalized citizens so they could actually own the land they were farming. It worked. 7 years later, in 1749, the community welcomed Jacob Hertzler, arriving that September aboard a ship called the St. Andrew, the first recorded Amish bishop in North America. For a moment, this wasn't a fragile cluster of refugees hiding in the woods. This was an organized, legally recognized, spiritually led American community, doing everything right, building exactly the kind of permanence its founders had crossed an ocean to find. So why does almost nothing mark that it was ever here? Drive the back roads of Berks County today and you'll find one Pennsylvania state historical marker planted in 1959, standing more or less alone on a quiet stretch of road near Hamburg. Behind it, if you know exactly where to look, there's a cemetery. Small, easy to miss, sitting on private land. That's it. No visitor center, no preserved main street, no excavated village. A settlement that once held the largest Amish population in the New World simply isn't there anymore. It vanished so completely that by the 1780s, barely a generation after it was founded, there was almost nothing left to prove it had ever existed at all. That absence is the first crack in the peaceful story. Communities that grow steadily, generation after generation, usually leave something behind. Buildings, town records, streets that grew up around them. Northkill left one marker and a hidden graveyard. Something didn't just fade here, something broke. To understand what broke, you have to go back further, to a religious argument that split a faith cleanly in half. In 1693, in the Swiss and Alsatian countryside, a tailor-turned-preacher named Jacob Ammon pushed his fellow Anabaptists towards stricter discipline, full shunning of excommunicated members, twice-yearly communion, plain and uncompromising dress. The disagreements ran deeper than clothing. A man wanted foot washing built into worship and strict enforcement of the toughest shunning provisions in the 1632 Dordrecht Confession, discipline severe enough to separate a husband from a wife or a parent from a child if the faith demanded it. Most of the Swiss brethren rejected it outright. Amon's followers refused to back down. The split became permanent. Those followers took his name. They became the Amish. It cost them almost everything. Already persecuted as Anabaptists across a Europe that saw them as dangerous religious radicals, Amon's people were pushed further to the margins, expelled from Alsace by 1712, scattered through the Palatinate, treated as unwanted outsiders wherever they landed. When William Penn began advertising a colony where a person could worship without a government deciding for them, it wasn't just an opportunity. For the Amish, it was close to the only door left open. In 1737, a ship called the Charming Nancy left Rotterdam for Philadelphia, carrying one of the first larger groups of Amish immigrants to the New World. Built in Philadelphia the year before, 115 tons, registered to men named Alexander Andrew and George Catenock, captained by Charles Stedman, it has been nicknamed, half-jokingly, the Amish Mayflower. The crossing was brutal. Weeks below deck in cramped, airless quarters, where sickness could move through an entire family before anyone understood what was happening. A passenger account attributed to a man named Hans Jacob Kaufmann records that 24 children died during the voyage. A Philadelphia newspaper at the time put the total closer to 30 deaths overall. Families buried their own children at sea and kept sailing anyway, because there was nothing behind them worth turning back for. The survivors who reached Pennsylvania that October didn't scatter randomly. A cluster moved to land along the Northkill Creek, joining families already settling there, and by 1740, they had what historians consider the first true organized Amish congregation in America. This was supposed to be the safe part of the story. It lasted less than 20 years. On the night of September 19th, 1757, in the middle of the French and Indian War, a raiding party, allied with the French, attacked the homestead of Jacob Hochstetler, one of the Northkill settlers. The family's dog woke them first. Jacob's son opened the door to check and was shot in the leg before he could close it again. And here's where this stops being a simple frontier tragedy and becomes something else entirely, because Jacob Hochstetler's sons had loaded guns in that house, and their father would not let them fire. Non-resistance wasn't a suggestion in this community. It was doctrine, absolute, non-negotiable, even while the cabin burned around them. Even with his family in immediate mortal danger, Jacob held the line. By morning, his wife, a daughter, and his wounded son were dead. Jacob himself, along with 2 surviving sons, was taken captive and marched away from the smoking wreckage of the home he'd built. He escaped roughly 8 months later and made his way back to give a first-hand account to a British officer named Colonel Henry Bouquet, a deposition that still sits today in the Pennsylvania archives, a direct 18th century witness statement describing exactly what happened that night, in the words of a man who lived through it. His 2 sons weren't as fortunate in how quickly they got out. Joseph and Christian stayed among their captors for years, only returning home once fighting between colonial forces and native nations finally wound down in the early 1760s. By the time they came back, the world their father had built at Northkill barely existed anymore. The community they'd been taken from as boys was already turning into something other people would eventually have to reconstruct from scattered paperwork. That attack didn't just devastate one family, it broke the settlement. Survivors scattered, some toward Lancaster County, some further west toward Somerset. Within a few decades, Northkill was essentially empty. The first Amish settlement in America didn't grow into a town. It emptied out and disappeared, leaving behind almost nothing except a story. Families kept quietly passing down, and a piece of ground nobody built a monument on for 200 years. Here's where the story should get simple. It doesn't. Start with the date. The 1959 state marker says the attack happened on September 29th, 1757. Hochstetler family records, and most family historians, insist it happened 10 days earlier, on the 19th or 20th. 10 days doesn't sound like much, but it means that for over 60 years, the official public marker for one of the founding tragedies of Amish American history has told a different date than the family whose ancestor actually lived through it. Nobody has ever fully resolved which one is correct. The debate has never fully disappeared, and it raises an uncomfortable question. If the state marker got the date wrong, what else did it simplify, or skip, or get comfortably close enough on? Then there's a stranger discovery, one that surfaced not in any excavation but in genealogical paperwork. For generations, family historians assumed there was a single Jacob Hochstetler who immigrated to Pennsylvania and became the direct ancestor tied to the massacre. Later research turned up something nobody expected. Two different men, both named Jacob Hochstetler, arriving in the same general period. For a stretch of family history, there's a real possibility the wrong Jacob was being credited as the founder of the line. It's the kind of error that sounds small until you realize entire family trees, entire claimed lineages, may have quietly been built on a mix-up nobody caught for generations. Even the names of the dead aren't fully settled. Different historical accounts give different first names for Jacob's murdered wife and the daughter killed alongside her that night, a small inconsistency that's easy to skim past and hard to fully explain. Maybe it's simple oral history wearing thin, retold across enough generations that a name eventually slips. Or maybe it's a sign that almost nobody outside the family ever cared enough to record it precisely the first time, and by the time somebody finally tried, the details had already begun to blur. And then there's the ground itself. According to local burial history, when a later settler dug the foundation for a new house on the same land, they uncovered human remains, the graves of the massacre victims, undisturbed since 1757. Nobody called for an investigation, nobody relocated the site. They built the house anyway and left the dead exactly where they were. Today, the closest thing to physical evidence connecting anyone to the original Hochstetler homestead is a stone cellar standing behind a private residence near Charlottesville, a cellar the current owner believes, based on family stories and its construction, might be part of the original structure. Believes, not confirmed, not excavated, not tested, a belief resting on top of a foundation that may or may not be the one that mattered. There's also a quieter, more scholarly disagreement worth naming honestly. Some historians point out that individual Amish families were already living near Northkill by 1736, 4 years before the congregation was formally organized, which raises the question of whether first should be measured by the earliest arrivals or the earliest organized church. In a settlement in Lancaster County, sometimes dated to around the same period or shortly after, is the oldest Amish community still in continuous existence today, since Northkill itself no longer exists. Northkill was first, Lancaster is oldest. Historians differ on which distinction matters more, and it isn't just academic hair splitting. For a community that defines itself heavily through lineage, through knowing exactly which family, which farm, which founding congregation you descend from, where we actually began isn't a footnote question. It's close to an identity question. And the honest answer right now is that nobody can give you a single clean date without a footnote attached to it. So here's where the tempting theory creeps in, and it's worth taking seriously before knocking it down. If the marker's date is wrong, if the wrong Jacob may have been credited as ancestor for generations, if human remains were found and quietly reburied without documentation, if the only surviving structure is identified by belief rather than proof, doesn't that sound like a story somebody wanted quietly buried? It's an understandable instinct. Small, isolated religious communities, without political power, have historically had their tragedies underrecorded, their records handled carelessly by outsiders who never considered the details important enough to get exactly right. But that's not quite what the evidence shows. There's no sign of a deliberate cover-up here. No missing case files. No institution actively suppressing anything. What you're looking at instead is something more mundane, and in its own way, more unsettling. A community that never prioritized monuments. State agencies that treated a massacre as a minor historical footnote worth one roadside sign. Nearly 200 years where nobody thought to check the official paperwork against the family's own surviving account. Nobody erased Northkill on purpose. It simply wasn't important enough to anyone outside the community to get right, and that historically is its own quiet kind of erasure. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it cuts against the instinct to hunt for a villain. Ask who benefits if the old, peaceful version of this story stays untouched, and the honest answer is almost nobody. Not the state, not a museum, not any single institution guarding its reputation. Ask who's embarrassed by a more complicated version, and again, there's no obvious target. This isn't a story about a powerful institution protecting a lie. It's a story about how easily an inconvenient, painful truth can simply stop being repeated, generation after generation, until it isn't a secret anymore. It's just forgotten. And forgotten, it turns out, can bury a story almost as effectively as hidden ever could. And here's what makes the silence at Northkill even stranger. This isn't some remote, forgotten corner of the country where nobody does this kind of work. An hour or two away, archaeologists at Millersville University have spent years professionally excavating colonial-era sites across Lancaster County. Teams working at historic Germanna, just across the Pennsylvania border in Virginia, are still opening up 18th century German immigrant farmsteads season after season, cataloging foundations and everyday objects. As recently as 2025, volunteer archaeologists in Bucks County were carefully excavating another colonial-era building foundation, pulling artifacts out of the ground that had been buried since the 1700s. Professional, funded, ongoing archaeology of exactly this era happens all around this region, regularly. It has simply never happened here, at the site of the first organized Amish congregation in America. Not because the ground has nothing left to say, because nobody with a shovel and a research grant has ever formally asked it. For 2 centuries, that's where the story stopped. A violent night, a scattered settlement, a handful of disputed dates that nobody outside a few genealogists cared enough to argue about. Then modern genetics did something the historical record never could. It didn't just describe what happened to the Amish after Northkill. It measured it. Here's the part almost nobody connects to a colonial massacre in Berks County. The Old Order Amish, as a population, are one of the most thoroughly genetically mapped human groups on Earth. Not because anyone set out to study a simple or isolated people out of pure curiosity, because their unique medical history forced researchers to look closer. Amish communities are what geneticists call a closed founder population, a group descended almost entirely from a small number of original ancestors, with very little new genetic material entering for generations afterward. That alone isn't unusual. What's unusual is how precisely researchers have managed to reconstruct it. Think of it like photocopying a photocopy. Copy an image enough times, using only the copies you already have instead of ever going back to the original, and small imperfections don't fade away. They get copied forward and magnified. A population that marries almost exclusively within itself works the same way. Whatever rare genetic quirks exist in the founding group don't get diluted out by new arrivals bringing in fresh genes. They get copied forward instead, generation after generation, until something that started as a rare, almost invisible trait in a handful of people becomes something close to routine in their descendants centuries later. A research team using a genealogical reconstruction tool called PedHunter built a 14-generation family tree connecting more than 34,000 living Old Order Amish individuals into a single traceable pedigree. When they worked backward to identify the founders, the original ancestors from whom that entire population descends, the number that came out was 554. 554 people, feeding an entire modern population numbering in the tens of thousands. It gets tighter than that. Of those 554 founders, researchers found that just 128 of them account for more than 95% of the genetic ancestry alive in the population today. 128 people out of nearly 500,000 living descendants. One name shows up again and again in Amish genealogical circles outside that formal study too. A family researcher working through generations of church and family records has estimated that roughly 98% of the Amish population today descends from a single 18th century immigrant named Nicholas Stoltzfus, who bought a home near Reading, Berks County in 1771. One man, 98%. If that estimate is even close to correct, it means most Amish alive today, whatever their surname, are carrying forward the bloodline of someone who settled less than an hour's drive from where the Northkill massacre happened, in the same scattered, rebuilding decade. That number alone should stop you. But it isn't just an abstract statistic sitting quietly in a research paper somewhere. It has a face, a name, a specific year, and a very real physical consequence still visible in hospitals today. In the 1960s, a research team out of Johns Hopkins, led by geneticist Victor McCusick, was investigating an unusually high rate of a rare genetic disorder among the Lancaster Amish, Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. It causes short-limbed dwarfism, extra fingers, and in a majority of cases, serious heart defects. Outside this community, it's almost never seen. In the general population, researchers estimate it affects something close to 1 in 12,500 people, if that. McCusick's team traced it back. Every case they found led to the same source, one couple. Samuel King and his wife, immigrants who arrived in southeastern Pennsylvania in 1744, just a few years after Northkill was founded. In the same wave of settlement, the massacre would later shatter. That single couple carried the mutation. Because the surviving population that rebuilt itself after events like the Hochstetler attack stayed so small and so genetically closed off that one couple's mutation never diluted away over centuries the way it would in a larger, more open population. It concentrated instead. Today, in the Lancaster Old Order Amish population, the carrier rate for that mutation sits at roughly 12.3%, better than 1 in 10. Compare that to the general American population, where it's closer to 1 in 12,000. That is not a small statistical difference. That is the genetic fingerprint of a population forced at some point through an extremely narrow bottleneck. It isn't only the male line's Y chromosome data that tells this story either. It isn't only Ellis Van Creveld. Researchers studying maternal DNA in Ohio and Indiana Amish communities identified 95 separate matrilines sorted into 7 major European genetic groupings, confirming plainly that there's no hidden or exotic ancestral twist buried in the maternal line, no secret admixture rewriting where these families actually came from. Some corners of Amish genealogy forums have speculated about unexpected ancestral surprises. The maternal DNA doesn't support that. What it supports instead is something quieter and, in its own way, more striking. An entire modern population's mothers reduced down to fewer than 100 original genetic lines. And researchers looking at Y chromosome data, genetic material passed directly from father to son, studied nearly 740 Amish men using that same genealogical database. They found the entire male lineage of the community reduces down to just 27 distinct founder Y chromosome patterns. 27 surnames account for the overwhelming majority of Old Order Amish households today. 7 of those 27 founders alone account for 83% of the men studied. Sit with that for a second. Nearly 700 men, spanning generations, carefully tested and painstakingly traced, and the entire male family tree of a religious culture numbering in the hundreds of thousands collapses down to just 7 names doing most of the work. There's one more twist buried in that same closed gene pool, and it isn't a disease. Researchers publishing genetic studies of Amish lipid profiles identified a rare Amish-enriched gene variant tied to unusually low levels of a certain blood fat, one linked to a lower risk of heart disease in carriers. The same tight, isolated founder population that concentrated a dwarfism mutation also happened to concentrate a mutation that, in some carriers, appears to be protective. The bottleneck wasn't only a curse, it cut both ways, and it's forcing researchers to rethink what a closed population even means. A group that can hand you both a rare, devastating disease and a rare, valuable protection from the exact same narrow set of ancestors. This is where the official story, the peaceful migration version, really starts to fall apart. A population doesn't get funneled through this few ancestors just by being religious, or private, or slow to intermarry with outsiders. Populations get funneled that tightly when something catastrophic thins them out. Disease, famine, violence, and the survivors are forced to rebuild from whoever is left standing. Researchers aren't claiming that one massacre at Northkill, on one night in 1757, single-handedly created this genetic bottleneck. That would be overstating evidence that doesn't exist. The bottleneck reflects generations of small, isolated founding communities deliberately marrying within the faith, combined with the sheer size limits of the earliest colonial Amish population as a whole. But here's what the science does support, cautiously. This was already a small, fragile population before 1757. An attack that killed and scattered members of its founding, largest settlement did not help. It isn't proof of direct causation, but it makes the quiet, uneventful growth version of the story much harder to defend out loud. That's the reversal, the one the peaceful version never saw coming. This was never really a story about faith, quietly surviving through calm, peaceful expansion. It's a story about a population that came dangerously close to not surviving at all, and whose survival was narrow enough that a disease invisible to almost everyone outside this community became one of its defining, measurable features. The genetic scan of that family tree didn't just confirm ancestry, it exposed exactly how thin the thread actually was. That thinness didn't stay in the past. It followed the community into the present, and it eventually forced outsiders to build something new because of it. In 1989, a physician named D. Holmes Morton, along with his wife Caroline, founded a small medical facility in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, later relocating to Leacock Township. It's called the Clinic for Special Children. Local Amish families helped raise the building themselves. Timber frame, built the way their own barns are built, by hand, together, in a single community effort. The clinic exists specifically to diagnose and treat the genetic conditions that come from exactly the kind of founder bottleneck the Ped Hunter research measured: Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, maple syrup urine disease, glutaric acidemia, and well over 100 other identified conditions tied to this population's narrow genetic base. Not far from Northkill, the restored homestead of that same Nicholas Stoltzfus, the man an estimated 98% of the Amish population may descend from, still stands near Wyomissing. It's preserved today by a dedicated homestead committee, complete with a rebuilt period barn added in 2011 specifically to serve as a small heritage museum. It's a strange kind of monument, a single farmhouse honoring a single man, quietly carrying the weight of a claim that borders on unbelievable that nearly an entire American religious population can trace itself back to the family that once lived inside it. Think about what that means. A community built on privacy, on separation from the modern world, on a deliberate choice to live outside mainstream institutions, now depends on a piece of modern genetic medicine that exists only because outside researchers mapped their ancestry more precisely than almost any population on the planet. The same isolation that helped preserve their culture is the reason their children carry disease rates unheard of almost anywhere else. You cannot separate the faith from the biology anymore. The 1757 attack and a modern genetic clinic sit at opposite ends of an unbroken chain of cause and effect that nobody at the time could have possibly foreseen. Meanwhile, the historical record is still being corrected, quietly, in real time. Groups like the Jacob Hochstetler Family Association and the Swiss Anabaptist Genealogical Association continue combing through baptismal records, immigration lists, and family Bibles, still trying to settle questions the 1959 marker never resolved: the real date of the attack, the true identity of the founding Jacob, the accuracy of the names attached to the dead. This isn't distant history to them. Descendants are actively working right now to correct a public record that has stood, largely unchallenged, for over 60 years. And there's a real tension sitting underneath all of it. This is a community that asks, as a matter of faith, to be left alone, plain, humble, resistant to outside attention. And yet science has now mapped their bloodlines with a level of precision most populations on Earth will probably never receive. Every founder counted, every mutation traced to a named couple, every surname weighted by its exact genetic contribution. The more the Amish choose to stay separate, the more precisely modern research seems able to see straight through that separation. Whether that counts as a gift or an intrusion depends entirely on who you ask. And the community itself has never been fully unified on the answer. Some interpret the genetic research as validating, even honoring, their history, a scientific confirmation that their ancestors truly did descend from a small, specific, traceable group of the faithful who refused to disappear. Others see something closer to exposure, private family lines, and inherited health risks laid out in public research papers, searchable by anyone, about a community that never asked to be studied this closely. Both reactions are reasonable. Neither one is wrong. There's a bigger question hiding underneath that disagreement, one that goes far beyond this one community. Who actually owns a population's past once outside science has finished mapping it? Not legally, not on paper, but in the sense that matters, the sense of who gets to decide what the story means. The Amish never asked researchers to trace their bloodlines this precisely. They simply got sick, sought treatment, and in doing so, handed geneticists an unusually clean, closed data set almost no other group on Earth could offer. The old story belonged to the families who lived it and quietly passed it down. The new story, the founders, the percentages, the mutation carried by one couple in 1744, belongs to journals, databases, and researchers who mostly aren't Amish at all. What's certain is this: the story most people know about the Amish, persecuted somewhere far away, sailed to freedom, quietly farmed for 300 years, was never entirely false. It was just incomplete in exactly the way that matters most. It skipped the massacre that scattered the very first settlement. It skipped the 10-day discrepancy nobody has resolved. It skipped the wrong Jacob possibly sitting in family trees for generations. And it skipped the fact that when scientists finally went looking for the roots of this population, they found something far narrower and far more fragile than anyone expected. 554 founders, 128 of them doing almost all of the work. 27 Y chromosome lines behind an entire modern population of men. 7 of those lines carrying 83% of it. If a story this size could hide in plain sight for 250 years, In one of the most documented states in the country, it's worth asking, what else has been quietly simplified the same way? If you want more real investigations like this one, into the DNA, the archives, and the discoveries that keep rewriting history's comfortable version, subscribe and stay close. And tell me in the comments, if researchers traced your own bloodline back the way they traced this one, how far do you think it would actually go before the story stopped checking out? Drive out past Hamburg, Pennsylvania today, and you can still find that 1959 marker standing on its quiet stretch of road, the paint fading a little more every year, the date on it still wrong by 10 days according to the family it claims to describe. A few miles away, behind a modern house near Charlottesville, that stone cellar is still sitting in the ground, still unexcavated, still identified only by belief and family memory rather than any formal study. Nobody has torn it open to find out for certain what it really was, or whether it was ever anything at all. But you don't need to dig up that cellar to find the evidence anymore. It's already been found, not in the dirt, but in the blood of nearly 400,000 living people, carried forward from a settlement that was supposed to disappear without a trace. Somewhere in that number, right now, is a living answer to a question the marker still gets wrong and the descendants have never stopped asking. If you know your own family's story, ask yourself how far back you'd actually have to go before it stopped being something you could verify and started being something you simply had to trust. For the descendants of Northkill, science has already answered that question for them, whether they wanted it answered or not. Nobody excavated that cellar. Nobody had to. The proof was never buried under the foundation. It was carried forward generation after generation inside the people who walked away from it. The cellar is still standing, quiet, ordinary, easy to drive past without a second glance. The blood remembers everything the paperwork left out.